European Union officials refuse to lift sanctions targeting Robert Mugabe until Zimbabwe makes more political progress. But are the measures helping, or should the West re-engage with Zimbabwe as it struggles towards change? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Shiulie Gosh. The EU says sanctions against Robert Mugabe and his most loyal officials will remain in force until more is done to implement the power-sharing agreement in Zimbabwe. EU delegates visited the country for the first time in 7 years. They held talks with both President Mugabe and the Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai. They raised their concerns over human rights violations and the slow pace of reform and said the time wasn't right to lift sanctions. Now, the measures include a travel ban on Mugabe and 200 of his closest Zanu-PF officials and a freeze on their assets in the EU. But as Haru Matasa reports, many believe these targeted sanctions have made little difference to the people of Zimbabwe.
The EU delegation visiting Zimbabwe sticks to its guns. Targeted sanctions on President Robert Mugabe and his close allies will not be removed. Sanctions that the EU argues are not hurting ordinary Zimbabweans.
But really, they are not affecting the economy in the way that as it's described. It's more to see that you have something to quarrel about. But there's so many more things now that needs to be done here. And European Union also can be able to do things. But we have not come here now to negotiate the restrictive measures or to discuss further aid programs. We have come here to have an assessment about how is the dialogue going on, both between the three signatories, but also, of course, how to encourage the political dialogue between EU and Zimbabwe.
Since the EU slapped sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2002 for human rights violations, more than $800 million has still poured into the country in humanitarian aid, and 130 million more is on the way. Aid that the EU says is helping millions in a country still recovering from the effects of hyperinflation and a cholera outbreak that killed over 4,000 people. This was one of the worst affected areas during the cholera outbreak. In this community alone, 170 people died and close to 4,000 people fell sick from drinking contaminated water. Boreholes installed by the NGO community have helped ease water shortages in some parts of the country. Ordinary Zimbabweans are divided on whether progress has been made in the country since the unity government was formed in February.
When they went into power, we were promised job for everyone, we were promised this and that, but at the end of the day, what we are seeing is the jobs are not there. The investment we were told about is not there. Even the money that we were told is coming from the IMF, it's coming from international community, it's not there.
As compared to last year, things were tough, but now we are able to survive.
President Robert Mugabe and Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai are still split over key government appointments under the Global Political Agreement, the official name of the power-sharing deal. Blaming each other for the country's political deadlock, outstanding issues are still unresolved. And right now, neither man seems ready to give in. Haru Matasa, Al Jazeera, Harare.
So let's discuss the issues. Joining us today are our guests. In London, George Shire, Zimbabwean political analyst. In Johannesburg, Ayesha Kajee, director of the International Human Rights Exchange Programme at WITS University. And in Brussels, John Clancy, spokesperson for the European Commission of Development and Humanitarian Aid. Welcome to all my guests today. So let's start with this thorny question of whether the EU was right not to lift sanctions. Mugabe says no. George, I know that you're going to support Mugabe's position. Tell us why.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to support anybody's position. I'm just going to try and clarify a number of things. First of all, the reasons these EU directives, smart sanctions, call it what they may, come into effect after the Zimbabwean government refused Pierre Shori to enter into the country and supervise the elections. And those grounds, the grounds for instituting those measures, they have shifted ground from day one ever since. And the second thing to notice is that the EU directives work in concert with what the United States have been doing. And the double impact on that means that the Zimbabwean government has never been able, since 2000, have access to balance of payment support internationally. And the impact of that is very clear for everybody to see. It goes directly to the people and ordinary people of Zimbabwe. So this is not about Robert Mugabe. This is not about the personage of somebody's being able to travel here and there. It's
but it is about the political
it has
situation in Zimbabwe right now. And the political situation is that there has been no progress in this power sharing deal.
Well, I mean, the idea that Europe can elect for itself the right to supervise what people who have a responsibility to guarantee the political negotiation in the country, that is, the political parties themselves, the Southern African Development Community, the African Union, who are all saying this is the best hope there is for Zimbabwe, an African solution to maintain, is absurd. What Europe should do is to go in there to assist the people of Zimbabwe as opposed to tell them how to live.
John, how do you answer George's criticism? I mean, those criticisms do have a pertinent point, don't they?
Well, I would actually suggest, George, that the Commission and the European Union as a whole is actually assisting at the moment the Zimbabwean population as a whole. Remember that the European Commission remains the key donor of humanitarian and essential development assistance to the vulnerable people of Zimbabwe since 2002, providing on average around 90 million euros in key direct assistance to them.
But so John, isn't there a veto on increased aid?
Let's just.
Sorry, I want to put that point to John. Isn't there a veto on increased aid and construction aid, and there's only limited assistance from NGOs?
Now, let's be very clear. Humanitarian aid is apolitical. Humanitarian aid is given to Zimbabwe like any other country that we may give our humanitarian assistance to on a needs basis. So we work with the international humanitarian community, that may be UN agencies, that may be the International Red Cross family, to analyse and then see what is needed on the ground, and then we try and provide the funds to ensure certain programmes can be carried out. For example, the efforts we've made, substantial efforts in restoring clean water to Harare and the surrounding region, which in your report mentioned the outbreak of cholera last year and into early this year. That's something we've worked very hard to assist communities to re-establish clean water, for example.
George?
Let me just nail a myth that
Sorry, George and then Ayesha.
That goes on. Okay. First of all, non-government organizations have realigned their activities in Zimbabwe since the donor countries themselves changed. Some non-government organizations pulled out as a result of those directives. And the second thing, if the question about cholera arises from the availability of fresh water, and at the same time NGOs say they do provide that, you can't have it both ways. We can't say on one hand fresh water or the lack of fresh water is the causal point at which cholera is a reason, and yet at the same time you say actually the outbreak of cholera has something to do with the governance issues, to do with human rights and Robert Mugabe. We must be clear what it means. The issue is not about humanitarian aid. It's whether or not this assistance that Zimbabwe gets
Let me bring Ayesha in here, because I know she wants to make a comment.
Developmental aid is the key.
Ayesha, what do you think? Would lifting the sanctions make life better for Zimbabweans?
Not for ordinary Zimbabweans, no, Shiulie, and I want to expand on that. Going back to George's first comment, where he says that this should be an African Union, SADC, and an African initiative with Zimbabwe, I wholeheartedly agree. And many African leaders last year, when increased targeted sanctions were proposed by the EU, actually said that they would have no effect. They have had no effect, really, in pressurizing those elites against whom the sanctions are targeted to change the government's policy stance. However, given that they are currently in place, I see no reason why they should be lifted at this juncture, because lifting them would not make effectively any change in the lives of ordinary Zimbabweans. Those are targeted sanctions on travel and on the movement of assets and finances for certain key individuals in the Zanu-PF government.
Okay, let's just remind ourselves. Before we go on, let's just remind our viewers of the key developments, some of which we're talking about here. The current sanctions were imposed against members of Mugabe's government back in 2002 for alleged human rights abuses. In March 2008, Tsvangirai won the first round of the presidential election. Violence erupted, causing Tsvangirai to withdraw, and Mugabe won the second round. In September, the bitter rivals signed a power-sharing deal under which Mugabe would remain as president and Tsvangirai would become prime minister. The new government was sworn in 7 months ago in February. So far, little progress has been made, with key appointments and crucial reforms still to be made. Now, this is what President Mugabe had to say after the recent EU visit. He said he thought the meeting had been successful.
I think the rapport we established, I think good rapport and no animosity. It was quite a friendly meeting and open. They thought GPA is not working, and yet everything that we were asked to do under GPA we have done, and done timeously even.
Ayesha, you were talking about SADC countries there and the roles of the AU and other African countries. Do you think we're going to see a tougher line now from South Africa, for example, because President Zuma has said that he is going to be more vocal?
Well, he certainly said so, and we're looking forward to seeing that happen, Shiulie. We're looking forward to seeing President Zuma apply more pressure on all parties, all three parties in the GPA, to fulfill their commitments. But given that, for example, key appointments such as the Attorney General, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, etc., were promised to the opposition, have not yet been instituted. And in fact, the current incumbents of those positions are individuals against whom the EU has slapped targeted sanctions. I think we really need to consider very carefully whether lifting those sanctions would make any difference to ordinary Zimbabweans, or whether those sanctions are just a convenient scapegoat for the current regime to actually say to the world, well, this is why we have economic collapse in our country.
I think we're missing the point again.
Clarify.
Let's bring George in first and then John.
I think we're missing the point again. The chairmanship of SADC has moved to DRC to Kabila, in which case Jacob Zuma cannot speak on behalf of SADC in the current context.
Okay,
what is interesting
that's fair enough, but South Africa has taken a mediating role. That's what we're talking about here.
Wait a minute. I think the detail of what is in place sometimes matters so that we can understand what we're talking about. The role South Africa played in getting the political institutions in Zimbabwe to talk about is commendable with the support of SADC. The role of the chair of SADC is to ensure we are guarantees of it, to ensure that that particular deal works. The last SADC conference unanimously threw out this request that somehow the sanctions should not be lifted and should be allowed to the progress of the GPA. So clearly what people are talking about is not going to be reversal of that policy. What you're going to see is an intensification of the SADC position urging Europe to remove the sanction. That is fact. We might not like Zimbabwean politics, we might not like Robert Mugabe, but it does not correspond to things as they are developing.
John, how much influence?
The last thing I would just say is that the more these sanctions remain, the easier it is to show that the MDC is aligned to the West. That in fact works against the MDC.
Okay, we'll take that. We'll talk about that last point in just a minute. I want to ask John whether the increasing pressure from African nations will impact on what the EU decide to do here on in.
Well, of course, we want to work with SADC, and we see SADC as a partner. I mean, and especially South Africa in terms of an important leading country in the region. President Zuma was himself in Harare and gave a very clear message in terms of needing or requesting that the Zimbabweans themselves move forward in the GPA process. And so the EU very much echoes that position. We want to see progress in the GPA so that we can see some change.
Is there a problem of perception that the EU isn't perceived as being so much in support of Zimbabwe as actually wanting to force Mugabe out?
No, not at all. What we have is a unity government, and what we want to see is unity in the political process moving forward.
But haven't all the EU policies been about forcing Mugabe out?
No,
you don't really want him to carry on, do you?
this is about trying to get the best situation for the Zimbabwean people. And I think from the meetings that we had both with President Mugabe and with Morgan Tsvangirai over the weekend, it was very clear that both sides, as well as, of course, Vice Prime Minister Mutambara, who's a third party to the agreement, saw the GPA as crucial. The question that remains is really a matter of interpretation by the different sides of how to implement the GPA in full and how to move the process forward. And if I can just quickly return to the issue of sanctions as you describe them, targeted measures is what we would describe them as. Let's be very clear. They are not economic sanctions of any form. As Ayesha rightly pointed out, they're targeted to individuals around Mugabe and a certain number of companies as well. They are purely regarding a travel ban and an asset freeze. And so in no way do they impact on the economic situation impacting on the people of Zimbabwe as a whole.
Okay,
I think we have to be very clear. The political policies, economic policies that have failed over more than, almost a decade now, are the reasons that international business will not invest in Zimbabwe. It's not because the EU has targeted several members of the political elite.
Okay, let's have a look at the GPA, because that is clearly crucial to what happens in Zimbabwe next. Here's what Morgan Tsvangirai said about President Mugabe's party on Sunday.
I am not going to stand by while Zanu-PF continues to violate the law, persecute our members of parliament, spread the language of hate, invade productive farms, ignore our international treaties and continue to loot our national resources. I'm not going to stand by and watch this happen.
Ayesha, the problem, as it looks from listening to that, is that we seem an awful long way from reconciliation.
We do. The language that we've heard over the last few days, perhaps coloured by the fact that this EU mission is happening for the first time in 7 years, has been inflammatory, to say the least, on all sides. However, it is an opportunity for political point scoring, and politicians being what they are, this is pretty natural. I think, however, that there is, some hope, given that all three parties to the agreement have clearly stated this weekend their commitment to the GPA and to implementing the agreement in its fullest and most comprehensive form. I think the thing that Zimbabwean people are most looking for now is movement towards a new constitution and the lifting of certain very, very restrictive laws on the free movement of people and their freedom of association and freedom of speech.
George, I mean, sanctions aren't the reason that key appointments haven't been made. Sanctions aren't the reason that the constitution hasn't been written. It's because Mugabe's party is blocking them.
Part of the problem in this discussion is the premise on which you make analysis. The two appointments in question were made before the GPA was into effect. They were not the subject of the GPA. That is fact. Morgan Tsvangirai knows it. The SADC knows it. Everybody knows it. And that's precisely why the MDC was unable to change direction, or despite the lobbying that they did in Kinshasa, to move the position of SADC in their kind of favor. That's one. The second problem that you have is the economic sanctions have an adverse impact on the people in the following ways. They work in concert with the directives from the United States, which are more specific. So they create a dual condition in which private finance, in which businesses, in which people can't function. They remove the confidence of the market to try and work. So it's illusionary to think that they just to do with someone else's trouble. Let's call them bluff. In what way have they changed the situation in Zimbabwe? They haven't. And the reason Morgan Tsvangirai wants them in place, because they are a leverage on. But the problem with it is that the more he maintains that position, the more the Zimbabwean people will be able to say something. It makes it easy for Zanu-PF actually to say, look, I've always been telling you the MDC is aligned to the EU. No political institution on the continent can gather dominance with the obvious support of the West.
Okay, that's a good point. Let me put that to John. Because that is a good point, George. John, if Morgan Tsvangirai can't show the people of Zimbabwe that things are improving, if things in fact aren't improving, he's in a very difficult position. He's got to justify joining a coalition government.
That's right.
Well, I think, I mean, here it doesn't really, help for me, who's part of the EU delegation that's just been visiting Zimbabwe, to be sort of seen to take sides. I think what's important is we have a unity government. Morgan Tsvangirai and Robert Mugabe need to work together. That's very clear. The GPA sets out the framework for that engagement together, and we are trying to encourage all sides, all three parties, to work together and move forward in the political process.
There is a perception of bias, though, isn't there? I mean, the Zimbabwe Justice Minister Patrick Chinamasa says that the EU delegation was biased in favour of the MDC. He says they just seem to want to undermine the inclusive government. They just swallow line, hook and sinker what the MDC says. So whatever you say, there is a perception of bias.
Well, I'm not sure of that perception of bias, across the international community or even in Zimbabwe. Of course, the minister's free to have his opinion. Of course, I think that opinion is largely shaped by, Zanu-PF perception, if you like. I think what's important here is not to get into trying to. I don't think it's helpful to start getting into, what Minister X or Minister Y has said.
And it's particularly
I think
not
what we
useful
have to look
for
at
the
is the
MDC.
overall
That's
impetus
the point
that we can give at the moment to the engagement process. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your question.
It's particularly not helpful for the MDC to be seen to be aligned, with these Western policies.
I think the MDC is aligned with trying to get the GPA fully functional and fully implemented. I think, the MDC want to see progress in Zimbabwe. One would hope that President Mugabe would also have the same vision for the people of Zimbabwe, and to start to see a vision of economic recovery and social recovery and recovery in the health service for the population of Zimbabwe. I think that's what's key and essential at the moment.
George is shaking his head. Ayesha, what do you think? What's the way ahead?
Well, really, I think the MDC has, in some instances, been accused justifiably of aligning itself with Britain or with the European Union, etc., because it has received funds, at the very least, from member states of the European Union. On the other side of that coin, however, that's been, again, a convenient scapegoat for Zanu-PF to colour perceptions of the MDC on the continent. Don't get me wrong, I'm not defending the MDC, I'm not taking a position here. However, I do want to clarify something that George said earlier. He said that certain positions had been pre-identified by the MDC. That may well be so. However, the GPA actually gives those portfolios to the MDC to fill. And Zanu-PF has obstinately and obdurately refused to fulfill those positions.
George, doesn't the GPA lay out who gets what?
The GPA does not in any shape or form, please. The GPA does not in any shape or form identify the Attorney General's office or the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe as offices that are up for negotiation. What it does say that the future operation of government must be arrived at consensually. The issue we have with those two appointments is that they were made before the GPA came into effect. What the MDC is demanding is for those two people being appointed to be sacked in the first instance. At the end of the day, the head of government, the head of state, Robert Mugabe, after consultation, if he wants and so on, has the responsibility to do so. So it's perfectly proper within the meaning of the GPA for Robert Mugabe to have made those appointments. You might not like them, but that's fact.
OK, let me ask one last question, because we are running out of time, and I just want to bring it back to the point of this discussion. John, very, very quickly, new ties between EU and Zimbabwe. Are we entering a new phase? Very quickly.
Yes, we are. We're looking to re-engage with Zimbabwe, but of course we have to work with the Zimbabweans and they have to work with us. So, I mean, the key to all of that is the GPA. We want to see progress by all sides, all parties in respect of the GPA, and that way we can certainly move forward in a political dialogue. We've asked our heads of missions to begin creating, if you like, a roadmap to create a path towards progress, political progress with the unity government. So we're very much want to see a momentum at this time, and so we're very encouraged by the situation, but we are also realistic and realise that there are sticking points that need to be worked upon. OK, thank you all very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. John Clancy, Ayesha Kajee and George Shire, thank you very much indeed for taking part in this programme.
And thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Do email us your comments at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But from me, Shiulie Gosh, bye-bye for now.